Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our first lecture, An Intro to Creative Arts, where we'll be talking about a few major things. One being the elements and principles of art, which are sort of like the building blocks of how we look at an image, as well as how we interpret that image. When we look at it, it's sort of the observation without much opinion attached to it, but just the objective observation of what are we looking at, as well as the interpretation of a piece and trying to figure out what does it mean, what is the artist trying to do. And we're going to look at a couple different types of mediums or how art is made in two-dimensional media, and then we'll talk about cinema and interactive media and installation. The reason that I bring cinema into this lecture is because even if you are someone not from an art background, I can guarantee you that most of us have probably seen a movie. So it's a really sort of universal way for us to apply these elements and principles to something we see very often. So starting with the elements of art, the elements are a little bit broader as far as terms in visual art, where the principles are a little bit more about the nitty-gritty details. The elements being line, shape and form, value, space, texture, and color. When we talk about line, obviously we have our sort of grade school definition of line as being a continuous point. We know what a line looks like. But in terms of visual art, the way that we look at line is to decipher how the artist uses it and why. And a lot of that starts with just identifying simply the types of lines used. Are they horizontal, vertical, diagonal? Do they overlap? Are they parallel? Are they geometric and straight and mathematical, or are they curved and organic? Are they thick? Are they thin? Are they organized? Are they chaotic? When we look at shape, obviously we know circles, squares, triangles, all of which are shapes, and the shape is just it's created by closing a line. But they can also be organic. So maybe shapes look more like an oyster shell or a swirl or a wave. So they don't need to be geometric to be a shape. But what makes them shape is that they are a two-dimensional expression of a shape, whether that is geometric or free form. And we express shapes flat in a two-dimensional surface according to length and width. Form, very similar to shape, although it's expressed in 3 dimensions. So that can be literal in that a sculpture or something made out of clay is a 3-dimensional object, but it can also be in a painting how we make something look as if it is 3-dimensional in sort of an illusory way. So if we have a building in a painting and we want to make it look as if there's length, width, as well as depth, that is expressing form even in 2 dimensions. Value, very simply, is how light and dark something is. So if it's light, bright, white, dark, dramatic, the difference in the contrast between light and dark is value. And usually when we're talking about value, that is in terms of a piece that is black and white. We'll talk about later what sort of value means in color. So know that value usually is, even if this image was in color, if we viewed it in black and white, it's just discerning the difference between light and dark. So space, just like when we were talking about 2 different types of line, whether that be geometric or organic, or contrasting elements within these terms, space can be the area around an object, and when it's around something, it's called a negative space, or it can be the space within something, which would be positive space. or it can quite literally refer to the feeling of space or depth. Are we in a room? Are we in a landscape? Those are a description of the space being portrayed. Texture is the surface quality of something. Is it smooth, hard, bumpy? Is it slick? Is it sticky, prickly, whatever that might be? And that can be the literal texture of something. So let's say if we have a painting and it looks like they painted it with a palette knife, that texture would also be the physical texture of the paint on the surface. Or it can again be an illusory texture. Are we making it look like it's made out of rubber? Are we making it look like it's slick? Are we making it look like it's bumpy? Color is how light is reflected off of objects, and it's described in three main ways. The hue is simply the name of the color. It's a red hue, a green hue, a blue hue. Value is how light or dark that color is. So just as we were talking about value earlier in terms of black and white, value in terms of color is light pink versus dark pink, light blue versus dark blue. Intensity is how bright or dull something is. So in terms of color, bright is going to be more like neon or fully saturated color versus something dull or subdued or a pastel. It's kind of a gentle color. So when thinking about line, it's really important to understand that all three of these are example of line, and they all utilize line, but in very, very different ways. So the picture on the far left by Albrecht Dürer, who was a German painter and printmaker during the Northern Renaissance. He created this piece. It's an example of printmaking by carving into a wood surface with a knife, putting ink on that surface, and then transferring it onto a piece of paper. So the line is quite literally achieved by carving each of those lines into a surface and then printing it upon a piece of paper. So the line here is very organized, it's systematic, it's geometric, and it quite literally is this whole piece is made up of line and is achieved with line because it was carved into the surface. And Julie Merutu's piece, and she is an artist really inspired by geography, maps, the idea of immigration and space. We see the lines as an organized chaos. It feels like it has both the organization that a city or an urban setting has, as well as the organization of the architecture of the space. So line is kind of used to both define and make it feel like a bustling, crowded city. Egon Schiele's piece on the right is rather simplistic and kind of incomplete. That left arm is not continued. The legs are not continued onto the feet. But he provides just enough detail that we can tell that there's a female figure, and the way that it's expressed is very organic and sensual. So all three of these are using line, but in very different ways. And in terms of printmaking, I wanted to talk about two different forms of line here. With Richard Correll's 4 pieces in black and white, we have something that's very bold and intense and stark. Whereas Swoon's pieces, otherwise known as Caledonia Curry, her style of printmaking is kind of sketchy and wispy and feathery, but all are achieved by carving into a surface, applying ink, and printing onto another. They both utilize line as one of their main elements, but in very different ways. We have bold versus kind of sketchy, wispy, and organic. So shape and form, just like we talked about, the main difference I want you to remember is shape is 2-dimensional, whereas form is a sense of the 3 dimensions. So the Stuart Davis painting in the middle is the best example in this slide of shape, because these are abstract flat shapes on the surface. None of them are particularly geometric, like there's no perfect circles, squares, triangles, but they all are two-dimensional flat shapes upon a surface. Form, however, in Jeff Koons's and Colleen Barry's piece on the left and right, is to give us the illusion of the form. So in Jeff Koons's, we get the idea of these balloons and their slick, rubbery sounds and textures, and we feel the reality of those forms. They look really realistic. Colleen Barry has this sort of fantastical wolf mother creature, but because she's so convincingly rendered it, we kind of believe it to be real because it really feels like it has skin and exists in space. So form can really be used very strategically to convince us of the reality of the narrative. Jeff Koons's piece is almost kind of has this optical illusion feel to it, but it's very convincing. He's created it so hyper realistically that it almost looks like it could have been a photograph, even though it was a painting. And that's kind of close up. So form here is really significantly used to convince us of the sound, the texture, the feeling, the volume of these balloons, and then how they kind of blend in and recede into this more abstract space. We have three pieces here that resemble the same subject matter, a kiss. But in shape, purely by the use of shape, Edvard Munch's piece on the far left is very simply two-dimensional shape of a kiss, but there's just enough information that we understand what is being portrayed. But nothing is obviously very voluminous. We don't get a sense of what these figures really look like, their volume and their form. So the emphasis here is their interaction. And by creating a simple shape out of this kiss, we're able to totally focus on these two people almost as if they're dissolving into each other. Their closeness and their intimacy makes them one. The two pieces on the right by René Magritte and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec are more three-dimensional. They feel a little bit more realistic. Lautrec's piece, the most realistic of the three, we get a sense of their skin, their volume, them in space within the drapery of the bedding, all of that. René Magritte's is a little bit kind of a combination of shape and form, where the background almost feels simplified or flat. His black blazer almost is reduced to a total shape. There's not much volume or dimension there. So again, the emphasis is the kiss and their faces underneath the drapery. So the form is the thing that's accentuated the most. Value, how light or dark something is. And you can see in the Caravaggio piece, light and dark is used to create a lot of movement, drama, energy. The Edgar Degas piece, the values, the very subtle use of light and dark defines that female form. And there's not really much else. There's a little bit of the blue in the background, but there's no skin tones, colors not defining things. The lines are kind of rough. So really this figure is relying upon, or Degas relying upon, light and dark to define this form. Then we have this piece like Georgia O'Keeffe's, where in order to portray this organic plant material, which I believe is a seed pod, the value renders it in light and shadow very realistically, like we could reach in and touch it and it defines it. And a kind of a fun term to know, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on in Module 4 in the Renaissance chapter, is the Italian term chiaroscuro, which literally means light and dark. And it was a phrase coined to describe Caravaggio and other Baroque artists' use of this stark light and dark to create this dramatic, energetic composition that relies so heavily on value. We also have Francisco Soto, who has sort of this balance between reality and fantasy. It kind of almost reminds me of like a Steven Spielberg movie where it feels a little fantastical or science fiction, but the accuracy that he renders everything and how meticulously he uses light and dark really convinces us that this could exist in reality. So value can be a really strong tool for an artist to convince us of their narrative, their world, their reality that they're portraying, and we understand it as, oh, this could exist because of how it's interacting in light and dark. Space, just like we talked about with this difference of negative space and positive space, here the space around the figure is the negative space, whereas her face and her hair are the positive space. It's filled in, it's given details. And space is used really strategically here for sort of the psychology of the piece. We're really able to be one with the character here and the subject matter and really feel her loneliness, the desolation, the void of the space. Whereas if it was filled in with objects or color or a window or multiple people behind her, we might not feel that as much. So that's that intentional use of negative space, is to portray a sense of loneliness or contemplativeness. Space can also be the literal description of what we're seeing in the scene. So a landscape, a room providing a window into the beyond, the boats on the water receding into space, and sort of this Venetian style landscape. So space can just also be the literal description of a landscape, a cityscape, whatever that might be. Texture. So with many of these terms, the thing I want to emphasize the most is there's the difference between the literal and the illusory, or the illusion of. So with texture, with Sonia Clark's wonderful work of her expression of her identity and the self-expression of Black women and their relationship with their hair, she utilizes real hair and real weaves to portray these designs, and they have the physical texture, the actual texture of hair to accentuate this narrative of this self-expression of hair and the styling of hair, versus the illusion of texture within Famous's piece on the right. This is not a photograph, it is a drawing. And he so amazingly, hyper realistically portrays this texture of skin, of wet, of dripping, but it's not wet to the touch. So that's why it's an illusion of that. But he convinces us of the reality of the texture and the wet of the skin by how he portrays it. Versus on the left, we have another example of texture, which is purely for emotive purposes. So obviously there's some sense of realism here. She's pretty accurately portrayed. We can see her eye and her face, but the reality is not the focus here. Otherwise it would be more like the piece on the right, where it's hyper realistically portrayed, or it really feels like it could be a photograph. Instead, Kathy Kolovitz focuses on the psychology behind the texture. So this rough texture is meant to feel kind of anxious or energetic. It's meant for us to feel her inner turmoil when she was creating this self-portrait. So that rough texture can also be an emotive element. So color is pretty obvious. It's probably the thing that we're exposed to the most in arts and media. But the differences that we kind of see in color is a vibrant use. It feels sort of chaotic, or it can feel energetic, it can feel romantic. It just has so many colors have this sort of recipe for what they make us feel. So these are good examples of multiple pigments being used, and they feel very kind of, I would say, energetic or bold, versus sort of different, more limited color schemes. We have value scale or gray scale, meaning black and white or the void of color. We have monochromatic, meaning that one color only is used in the blue piece. We have dichromatic, where only two colors are used, blue and red, and then obviously you have the white of the paper as well. And then we have something called a limited palette. So instead of this being a series of several colors, especially the alphabet Jasper Johns piece, where you almost lose track of how many colors there are, a limited palette is a little bit more strategic in that it chooses a few colors. So in the piece on the right, we have the purple, the orange, and the teal. And then every color that we see is a combination of those colors, whether it's the lighter or darker purples, the pink purples, the darker kind of more purpley purples, the light teal sage greens versus the darker teal turquoisey greens, and then the orange. So every pigment is a kind of combination of purple, green, or turquoise, and orange. So those three pigments create a limited palette. And one very cool thing about James Dean is that he's very famous recently for doing fine art movie posters. And one thing that I think he's the most strategic with in his elements and principles of art, or his use of these, is that he chooses his colors to really embody the tone of the movie, the mood, or the genre. So in the Shape of Water poster on the far left, whether you've seen it or not, you can tell by that bluish monochromatic color palette that it feels very fantastical, maybe even a little science fiction. We get the sense of the creature. We're able to focus on their embrace versus kind of being distracted by too many colors. It also feels very aquatic and underwater, which works for a movie called The Shape of Water. Pinocchio has kind of that limited palette where we mainly see sage green, purple, and brown, and a little bit of orange. But it has a very vintage kind of nostalgic color palette to it, especially that sepia brown color makes us think of kind of old-timey photos or puppets or wood or organic material. So all of that kind of accentuates this nostalgic story that we've all been told or have heard of Pinocchio. On the very far right, we have his movie poster that he did for Blade Runner, which is really high intensity, very vibrant, but again, just kind of two pigments. But it feels very geometric, very science fiction. We can get a sense of the genre just from the colors and the shapes alone. The two pieces in the middle are used for a single movie. I believe it's called Mother. And it's meant to feel tumultuous, dangerous, dangerously romantic. And we kind of get the sense of that in these color palettes as well. All right, so now let's talk about the principles of art, which are, again, a little less broad as the elements, and they're focused more on the nitty-gritty details of a piece. So within the principles, we have balance, focus and emphasis, movement, scale and proportion, repetition and rhythm, variety, pattern, emphasis, and focal area. So balance, very similar to this idea of symmetry or asymmetry, radial symmetry, which is around a central point. It's basically how an artist balances a piece or establishes stability or equilibrium. Does something on the left also occur on the right to balance out a piece? Or does something in the foreground also occur in the background? Whatever that might be, that is the artist establishing balance. Focus and emphasis is quite literally how an artist stresses something. So what they tell us is the most important aspect of the piece by saying this is the subject matter, this is the most important. So whether that's directing our eye to the subject matter, creating the subject matter as the most high contrast or colorful part of the piece, no matter how they do it, it is the focus or the emphasis according to what the artist is telling the viewer, this is the most important. Movement is sort of either literally portraying movement like a dancer, or the feeling of action or how the viewer's eye is guided around the page. Scale or proportion, this can literally be describing something as small or large, but it's also the relationship of size. So how elements within a single painting is accentuated by making something look big because something else is small. Repetition or rhythm is the use of repeated elements, and this can be used to create movement. It can be to create a visual tempo or a beat. Unity or harmony is a way of combining or repeating elements, often by the use of repetition, to accentuate similarities or create something that feels reliable. If we see one circle and then it occurs multiple times, it becomes something reliable, like a pattern. Variety is quite literally the accentuation of the diversity or the contrast. So whether that's using different shapes, sizes, colors, it is to accentuate how things are different more than how they are alike. Pattern is very related to unity and harmony and repetition and rhythm, but it literally just means the uniform repetition of something within a piece, whether that be shapes, the repetitive use of color, anything can be turned into a pattern. It doesn't have to literally be a pattern like a wallpaper pattern. Contrast, very similar to value, is relating how opposite or different things are. So value in and of itself has a stark contrast between light and dark, but contrast can also occur large and small, bright versus dull, whatever that might be. So balance. Here we have the hands are very much balancing this piece. We have her hand sort of on the throat of the child, balanced with her pinky finger touching the child's hand. And that creates a balance in the piece because it's occurring left and right, or top left-hand corner and bottom right-hand corner. With the figures there in the center, or emphasized in the center of the piece. It creates balance because it's occurring more than once on opposite ends of a piece. We also have this idea of having something emphasized in the background as well as in the foreground to balance a piece. So showing a landscape far off, or the carriage, and then having the woman in the foreground with the rabbits, or the woman in the foreground with the mushrooms, balanced with having birds and a landscape in the background. The background and the foreground are working together to balance the piece. Focus or emphasis. So with having a stark white background, we don't need to guess what the subject matter is here. It is emphasized. Because everything is dark and kind of void of people around the Phillies diner, we know that the subject matter or the emphasis is those who are still awake at this late hour inside the diner. That's the focus, the emphasis, where our eye goes to. Movement. So we have the literal portrayal of things happening in motion, but also the elements across the page have this almost circular moment to it, where I enter the piece at the chair, see the figure, follow the water, follow the cats back to the chair. So it has almost kind of a circular movement to it. The portrayal of movement. So we have this abstract piece by Duchamp, which is showing a nude descending a staircase. And even though it's abstract and we might not be able to discern, every aspect of a figure or see it as if it was a photo or realistically portrayed, we can still get this indication of something descending. Degas literally portraying movement and portraying a dancer, but also his brush strokes and the way the colors are applied also feel very in motion and kind of blurred. Yoko Ono's piece on the right was created by the motion that she created. So all those marks on the wall, she had to create movement in order to make those strokes. So her movement is portrayed and the artist's hand is shown in the mark making. Scale and proportion. So in the piece on the left, which is by Rene Magritte, also just like that one piece we saw on the kiss, the figures that are bigger feel like they're closer to the viewer versus the figures that are smaller look further away, so that it gives us a sense of scale or proportion in order to get a sense of depth. We also, on the piece on the right, can tell that all the moons in the foreground are most likely the size or the proportion of the one in the background, kind of creating a surreal image of hanging the moon. Repetition and rhythm. Kusama is known for her polka dots, so obviously by the repetitive use of polka dots, you get a pretty strategic use of repetition here. But those big spread apart polka dots in the background, the red ones on the white background, feel sort of slower than those white polka dots on the red, on the tentacle-like things. They feel closer together and more in motion or energetic than the ones in the background. And that just shows you that repetition can give us this visual rhythm that we can sort of use to perceive it in different ways. Van Gogh is known for his use of brushstrokes, and those brushstrokes not being smoothed over but left apparent. And we get the feeling of his psychology, of the tumultuousness that he might have been feeling. And then Andy Warhol's piece on the right quite literally shows the mass production of something. Pop art usually was this sort of commentary on popular culture or mass culture. So the idea of the same soup can being printed multiple times kind of gives us this sense of mass consumerism or factory-made objects. Unity and harmony. We can rely upon unity and harmony to give us a recipe. So with Chuck Close's piece on the left, those dots are almost like pixels, and that's what make up the whole composition. And those dots are reliable because they're used so consistently that unity or harmony creates that recipe. Pat Steers on the right, even though it's a little less, precise than the same dot being used multiple times, those drips and the way she's dripping on the canvas is really consistent and has a unity and harmony to it. We understand that the three main waterfall-like drips are different than the ones that are kind of going horizontally across the bottom. Variety. So a lot of times when I think of variety, I think of mixed media, meaning they're using multiple materials to make their piece. So variety can be sort of the contrast between something that's patterned and something that's plain, a white background versus polka dots. It can also be a variety of materials, collaged, painted, fabric, sewn, woodworking. It's a variety it can be a variety of all sorts of textures, materials, whatever that might be. Contrast. Barbara Jones Hogu is known for this really vibrant, dramatic use of highly saturated colors versus this kind of black, dark, more subdued values. And that stark contrast really makes us feel the power of the image, which is really riddled with identity and social protest. Without that feeling of contrast, the power of that imagery could have been lost a little bit. Kehinde Wiley, who's really known for the very famous portraits of Michelle Obama and Barack Obama, it has this beautiful sense of contrast in sort of simple areas of organic textures and tones in the skin and the denim versus the highly vibrant, patterned, two-dimensional feeling of like the wallpaper and the plants. So it's this sort of beautiful use of contrast to accentuate the figure and what they're feeling. So I've mentioned the word medium a couple of times, and I want to talk about what that means. And no, it does not mean someone who can talk to the dead, at least not in the context of art. Medium is the process used by an artist. So what did they use to make it? Whether that be a painting, a clay sculpture, the medium is how they made it or what material they used to make it. So with dry media, that can be drawn with charcoal, chalk, pastel, graphite. Liquid media can be pen and ink, watercolor, oils, acrylics, tempera, fresco. Mixed media and collage. Photography can either be film or digital. Printmaking can be relief or woodcut. There's just so many different types. But those are what I mean throughout the course when I say the medium the artist used is what did they use to create the work. So dry media, obviously it has a dry medium that applies the image to the surface like charcoal, pastels, or pencil. And this can be used in a way that we can see the mark making or in a way that's hyper realistic and we almost can't tell that it's a drawing, but either way, it's drawn media or dry media. We might want to leave the textures rough for the psychology of something, or we want to refine it because of the precision, but either way, it's dry media. Liquid media, painting. Now, what's sort of beautiful about the image by Sargent on the left is we can kind of see the brushstrokes and see the paint on the textured surface of the paper versus Andrew Wyeth's is more refined to almost look like it could be a photograph. We have a painting here that's made to look like sort of expressive or abstract, kind of like an object, but all of which is a liquid media no matter how they use it or apply it to a surface. We have the use of oil paint here to make something feel smooth like the texture of skin versus the patterns of the flowers, but again, all liquid media. Drips, quite literally liquid media, which would be obvious from a mile away. Photography and mixed media and collage. We have film, digital, something called double exposure, etc. So Sally Mann is a very famous film photographer. She uses very old processes that date back to the 1800s even for her black and white photography, and she has her own dark room set up and all of that. So think of an older traditional form of photography when you think of film photography. Double exposure is when you have the photograph of something and then lay another image on top of it. So obviously we have a person and the portrait of a person, but they put the exposure of another image on top of it. So these natural elements to give us this feeling of a double exposure. You don't need to know that, it's just kind of fun to know. And then obviously digital photography, where we use digital camera, digital editing to make something feel like it is computer generated or whatever that might be. And digital photography can be purely realistic as well, but this is an example of digital photography as well as digital editing. Mixed media and collage, we talked a little bit about with variety, kind of that copy and paste look. So whether we cut things out and paste it on a surface, use a combination of applied mediums and paint, as well as collaging different materials in there. Julie Meritus, just like we talked about, she uses a combination of so many different mediums: acrylic paint, ink, graphite, collage. Gustav Klimt, he painted a lot on surfaces, but he was also known for collaging in gold leaf as well. Delita Martin's piece that we talked about with variety, she oftentimes collages patterns or sews into her canvases, uses fabrics as well as painting. Printmaking, so the idea of carving into a surface, whether that be wood or linoleum, applying ink to that surface, and then making a transfer onto a piece of paper for the final result. We have woodcuts, so they were carved into a piece of wood and then applied onto a surface, which have a very linear or bold look to them. We have the more kind of etching or carved look to printmaking, where the lines are a little wispier or sketchier. Bold, linear printmaking, you really got to think of it either being carved or applied almost like stencils. So it's pretty easy to determine something is printmaking, especially when it's as bold as this is, because it really has that carved look to it. Intaglio is kind of the opposite of relief painting, where you transfer ink to the paper not from raised areas, but rather from the grooves cut into the metal plate, almost like scratching it into the metal plate versus removing big chunks of wood, and then whatever is left is what transfers on. And a lot of intaglio can be line engraving, etching, dry point, mezzotint, stipple engraving, aquatint, whatever that might be. These, again, you won't need to know for a test or anything like that. It's just kind of for your information, especially as you do research in your own sort of artist that you're interested in or artworks. I just want to make sure that if someone lists their work as a piece of intaglio, I just want you to be able to know, oh, I remember what that is. It's a form of printmaking. And here's some examples of what that can look like when it's sort of etched into a surface versus carved in there, almost like drawing. This is also a form of mezzotint as well. And screen printing is probably the closest thing to stencils, and usually the colors are applied separately. So the purple would all be applied at once, the green next, the orange following that, the black next. So it's creating a piece in layers, and every layer is a different color or different texture. Andy Warhol is one of the most famous artists associated with screen printing, as well as Roy Lichtenstein, who had a very sort of comic book style to his printmaking. And so what I want to end with today is installation in 2D art, because you'll be utilizing this for your discussion forum. So installation, what that means is a large scale mixed media construction, which is often designed for a specific place or a temporary period of time. So installed in an art gallery, but it's going to be taken down later. The fact that it is installed and it has this impermanence to it is what makes it an installation. But how can installation be considered 2D art? Well, if you're in person and experiencing that installation, it's three-dimensional because you're in the space and seeing it installed. But most oftentimes the way that we perceive installations is because they were documented with photographs or with video. So if we're not able to go to that museum in Italy, but we see photographs of the installation, it almost becomes a piece of 2D. So this is an instance where 3D and two-dimensional art, that line gets blurred a little bit. But the main thing to think about when you think of installation is that it can be installed and deinstalled, and it's usually temporary. So whether it naturally decomposes if it's made in nature, or if the artist quite literally takes it down after the exhibit is over, it has that temporariness to it. So here's an example of the 3D becoming 2D. So obviously Kusama's pieces here were an installation that people could go and be in the space and experience in the space. She is in her piece in the left, but the photographs of these and how we are experiencing them, having not been able to go to these places, they also become a 2D artwork as well, a photograph of these installations. Swoon is also known for installations in that these are sculptures. She often uses models who she dresses up in costumes or makes sculptures of figures. Oftentimes she projects videos and screens on walls. So obviously, if you're there in person, you can experience this installation in 3 dimensions, but then those of us who didn't get to go to the installation can experience this in 2-dimensional form through these photographs. Another example. So this is one of my favorite examples of the blurring of 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, and that this is installed in a space. If we're there in person, we feel it in 3 dimensions, but in the photograph, it's 2D, as well as the piece itself is a 3-dimensional sculpture, but the shadows that the light creates on the walls is also a 2D shape. So this kind of combination of shape and form. So know that a lot of the elements and principles we talked about today, they have very distinct literal meanings, but artists really like to challenge those definitions and blur the lines between shape and form, between 2D and 3D. Rules are meant to be broken most of the time, but it's understanding these building blocks that we can understand how the artists are using the elements and principles and how they are breaking the rules or following the rules. Ji Young Lee, she creates these installations within the space. They're oftentimes available to be visited. However, most often she creates these in her gallery space only for her to be photographed within them. So the piece that remains is the final photograph. So again, a great representation of a blurring between 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional, or installation and a photograph. And this is her photographed in each of these pieces. Okay, so for your discussion forum this week, you'll have a response to the Beyond Van Gogh installation. So you'll see a video that details this exhibit where they took Van Gogh's paintings and created an interactive media installation, and you'll contemplate that, the controversy of it, the transformation of a 2D medium to 3D. So that's one of your assignments, and see the discussion forum for all, the details of what you'll be doing. And you'll also have a research response discussion forum where you'll evaluate the elements and principles of art as seen in cinema. So you'll have this video to watch where it talks about where do we see the elements and principles in cinema. And then you'll pick a movie where you provide us with an example of movie stills or screenshots, if you will, where you discuss the movie and where you saw elements and principles. So my example here is Blade Runner, and I chose these 3 movie stills, and you'll see in my post or in my example the elements and principles that I identified